She never imagined that helping a crippled beggar at her own mother's burial would save her life. As her father and evil stepmother beat her mercilessly in front of the open grave, calling her worthless and pathetic, they had no idea who that beggar really was, or what he was about to reveal. You see, while they thought she was just a disappointment with nothing to her name, she had secretly inherited a $50 billion real estate empire. And that beggar she helped? He was her mother's lawyer, arriving in disguise to test her character before the will reading. What happened next at that reading completely crushed them both and changed her life forever. This is the story of how one act of kindness exposed the truth and destroyed the people who tried to destroy her. The rain fell like bullets on Margaret Chen's shoulders as she stood before her mother's mahogany casket, her black dress clinging to her trembling frame. 23 years old, and already burying the only person who'd ever loved her. The cemetery stretched endlessly around Oak Grove Memorial Park, but Margaret felt suffocated by the small gathering. Her father, Richard, his new wife, Victoria, and a handful of her mother's former colleagues who'd come out of obligation rather than affection. "Move faster, you useless girl," Victoria hissed, her crimson lips curling with disgust as Margaret struggled to place a white lily on the casket. The woman who'd slithered into their lives just 6 months after her mother's cancer diagnosis now stood there, dripping in black Chanel, her manicured nails digging into Richard's arm like a parasite claiming its host. Margaret remembered the day she'd come home from college to find Victoria in her mother's kitchen, wearing her mother's apron, cooking in her mother's pots. "Your father needs someone strong," Victoria had said with that same twisted smile. "Your mother's too weak. Cancer, you know. Such a shame." The memory made Margaret's stomach turn, but she'd learned to swallow her rage. Her mother, Catherine Chen, had made her promise. "Stay quiet, sweetheart. Survive. I've made arrangements." Those arrangements remained a mystery. Catherine had died 3 days ago, her final words whispered through morphine-heavy breaths. "Trust no one but him. He'll come for you. He'll look broken. But he's not." Margaret had no idea what her mother meant, and grief had swallowed the questions before she could ask. "Lower it," the priest intoned, and the casket began its descent into the earth. Margaret's knees buckled, but she caught herself against a weathered tombstone. That's when she saw him, a crippled beggar huddled against an oak tree 30 feet away, his twisted leg bent at an unnatural angle, his tattered coat soaked through. Something about his eyes, sharp and calculating despite his apparent misery, made Margaret's breath catch. "Spare some change for a cripple, miss," he called out, his voice ragged but oddly articulate. "Your mother was kind to me once. Would have wanted you to be kind too." Victoria's laugh cut through the rain like a blade. "Richard, look at this. Your pathetic daughter probably wants to give our money to street trash on the day we bury her failure of a mother." Richard's face, once kind before Victoria's poison had seeped into his veins, twisted with manufactured anger. "Margaret, you will not embarrass this family. Get back here immediately." But Margaret had already started walking toward the beggar. Something in his eyes, a flash of recognition, of knowing, pulled her forward. Her mother's dying words echoed. "He'll look broken, but he's not." "Margaret!" Victoria's screech pierced the air. "Richard, are you going to let your worthless daughter disrespect us like this?" Margaret reached the beggar and knelt in the mud, pulling a $20 bill from her pocket. As she pressed it into his gnarled hand, he whispered, "Your mother loved you more than you know. 3 o'clock tomorrow. The reading. Everything changes." "You dare!" Richard's hand grabbed Margaret's hair, yanking her backward with such force that she slammed into the muddy ground. The world exploded in pain and humiliation as her father's fist connected with her ribs once, twice, 3 times. Victoria's designer heel pressed into Margaret's shoulder, grinding her into the earth beside her mother's open grave. Worthless. Pathetic. Just like your mother. Richard's voice, once so loving, now roared with Victoria's venom. You have nothing. You are nothing. As Margaret's vision blurred with tears and rain, she saw the beggar hobble away, and despite the agony radiating through her body, she saw him smile. Margaret's cheek pressed into the mud beside her mother's grave, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth as Richard's polished Oxford shoe lifted from her ribcage. Rain mixed with tears and dirt, creating a grotesque mask across her face. The mourners, her mother's former colleagues, had already scattered to their cars, unwilling to witness the brutality or too afraid of Victoria's influence to intervene. Get up, Victoria spat, her designer heel inches from Margaret's face. You're embarrassing us in front of the groundskeeper. Though I suppose crawling in filth is where you belong. Margaret's fingers clawed at the earth, searching for purchase, but her ribs screamed in protest. Through her swollen eye, she watched the crippled beggar disappear behind the oak trees, his twisted gait somehow purposeful despite the limp. 3 o'clock tomorrow. The reading. Everything changes. His words burned in her mind, brighter than the pain radiating through her body. Richard, we're leaving, Victoria announced, already walking toward their black limousine where Marcus, the new driver, stood waiting with the door open. Let her walk home. Maybe the exercise will teach her about respecting her betters. Richard hesitated, and for a flickering moment, Margaret saw something in her father's eyes, a ghost of the man who'd once carried her on his shoulders, who'd taught her to ride a bicycle, who'd called her my little empress. But then Victoria's hand slid around his arm, her red nails digging into his expensive suit, and the ghost vanished. She walked over to that filthy beggar, Victoria continued, her voice saccharine poison. Let her walk home with the rest of the trash, unless you want to coddle her like Catherine did. Look where that got your ex-wife, dead and forgotten. The words ex-wife stabbed deeper than Richard's fists had. He'd divorced Catherine. When? Margaret's mother had never mentioned, but of course she hadn't. Catherine had been protecting her, keeping her daughter away from the legal carnage Victoria was orchestrating. Fine, Richard muttered, not meeting Margaret's eyes as she struggled to her knees. Margaret, you'll walk home. Consider it penance for your disrespect. Margaret watched the limousine glide away, its red tail lights disappearing into the gray afternoon, like demon eyes retreating into fog. The priest had vanished into the chapel. The groundskeeper deliberately turned his back, unwilling to help. She was alone with her mother's corpse and the rain. Miss Chen? A voice, different from the beggar's ragged tone, emerged from behind a marble angel statue. Margaret's head snapped up, pain lancing through her neck. A woman in her 50s, wearing a simple black dress and carrying an umbrella, approached carefully. I was your mother's personal assistant. Mary Richardson. I was let go 3 months ago. Mrs. Blackwood's orders. Blackwood, Margaret choked out, remembering her mother's warning about Victoria's real name. Mary knelt beside her, offering a handkerchief. Your mother knew what was happening. She sent me a message 2 weeks before she died. Made me promise to watch over you from a distance. Mary's eyes filled with tears. I watched them beat you and couldn't intervene. I'm so sorry. But I can drive you somewhere safe. No. Margaret forced herself to stand, every muscle protesting. I need to go home, to that house. I need to survive until tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Mary's expression shifted to understanding. The reading. You know about it? A beggar told me, Margaret said, testing her weight on legs that felt like shattered glass. At least, I think he was a beggar. Mary's smile was knowing and sad. Your mother always said you were smart. Come. My car is parked outside the gates. I'll drive you close to the house, but not too close. Victoria has cameras everywhere now. She's turned your home into a surveillance prison. During the 15-minute drive, Mary revealed fragments of Victoria's scheme that made Margaret's blood run cold. 3 months ago, Victoria brought in an entire team, accountants, lawyers, people who specialized in corporate theft. They've been forging your mother's signature on documents, transferring properties into shell companies, liquidating assets. I tried to warn Catherine, but by then, she was too weak to fight. Why didn't she call the police? Margaret asked, pressing the handkerchief against her bleeding lip. She did. Victoria had already paid them off, or at least the ones who mattered. Your mother's lawyer tried to intervene, but Victoria filed a restraining order, claiming he was harassing a dying woman. The system failed her, Margaret. So Catherine got creative. Mary pulled over 2 blocks from the Chen estate, hidden behind overgrown hedges. Whatever your mother planned, it's bigger than Victoria understands. Be careful tonight. Victoria's paranoid. She thinks Catherine hid assets somewhere she can't find them. She'll be watching you. Margaret stepped out of the car, her body a symphony of agony, and began the final walk to her childhood home. The mansion loomed ahead, its white columns now seeming like prison bars. As she approached, Marcus materialized from the shadows of the service entrance, his cold eyes assessing her damage with professional detachment. Mrs. Blackwood wants you in the basement, he said flatly, grabbing her arm with bruising force. Says you need to think about your behavior. He dragged her through the kitchen, where her mother's staff had been replaced by Victoria's people, and toward the basement door. Margaret caught a glimpse of the portrait gallery. Her mother's face had been removed, replaced by Victoria's sneering visage, dripping in emeralds that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother. The basement door slammed shut, and darkness swallowed her whole. Margaret collapsed onto the concrete, but her mind was racing. Her mother had planned something. The beggar knew about it. Mary confirmed Victoria's theft. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, everything would change. Above her, floorboards creaked. Victoria's voice drifted down, sharp and celebrating. Tomorrow, Richard, darling, we watch your pathetic daughter learn she's inherited absolutely nothing. The will reading will destroy her completely. Margaret smiled in the darkness, tasting blood and vindication. Victoria had stolen everything she could find. But Catherine Chen had been hiding something Victoria never discovered. And in 16 hours, that something would detonate. The basement darkness pressed against Margaret's eyes like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Hours crawled past. She counted them by the chiming of the grandfather clock in the foyer above, each gong a reminder that she was still breathing, still surviving. At midnight, she heard Richard and Victoria retire to the master bedroom, her mother's bedroom, and the sounds that followed made Margaret want to claw her ears out. Victoria's performative moans were designed to carry through the house, a final desecration of Catherine's memory. At 2 a.m, footsteps creaked above her head. Margaret held her breath, listening. The basement door opened with a screech of rusted hinges, and a sliver of light cut through the darkness. Margaret's muscles tensed, expecting Marcus or worse, but instead, a small figure descended the stairs. Miss Margaret? The voice belonged to Rosa, the housekeeper who'd served the Chen family for 15 years. I brought you water and bandages, quickly, before Mrs. Blackwood wakes. Rosa's hands trembled as she cleaned Margaret's wounds by the light of a small flashlight. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. Your mother was good to me, paid for my daughter's college. But Mrs. Blackwood said if I help you, she'll have my family deported. She has ice on speed dial, shows me the number every morning as a reminder. Margaret gripped Rosa's hand. I understand. You have to survive too. Your mother knew, Rosa continued, working quickly. 3 weeks before she died, she called me to her room when Mrs. Blackwood was out. She gave me this. Rosa pressed a small envelope into Margaret's palm. Said to give it to you the night before the reading. Said you'd need courage. Margaret's fingers shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Her mother, young and radiant, standing beside a tall Asian man in front of a Manhattan skyscraper. On the back, in Catherine's elegant script, Shanghai Dragon Holdings, 1998. Some empires are built in shadows. Trust the crippled king. He never forgot what I did for him. Before Margaret could ask questions, Rosa had vanished back up the stairs, the door locking behind her with a finality that echoed through Margaret's bones. She stared at the photograph, her mother's words from weeks ago suddenly making terrible sense. Catherine hadn't just been a real estate developer. She'd been something more. Someone who'd built an empire so vast and so hidden that even Victoria's theft had only scratched the surface. The crippled king, the beggar at the funeral with his twisted leg and knowing eyes. Margaret didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness, memorizing every detail of the photograph, feeling pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place. Her mother had been protecting something, or someone, for over 25 years. At 6 in the morning, the basement door crashed open. Marcus descended with a bucket of cold water and threw it over Margaret, the shock making her gasp. Mrs. Blackwood says you have 15 minutes to make yourself presentable for the reading. You'll wear what I give you, nothing else. He threw a shapeless gray dress at her feet, deliberately ugly, deliberately humiliating. The message was clear. Victoria wanted Margaret to look like a beggar at the reading, wanted the lawyer and any witnesses to see exactly how far the Chen daughter had fallen. Margaret showered in the basement's utility bathroom, the cold water stinging her bruised flesh. She dressed in the gray sack that hung on her frame, like shame-made fabric, but as she looked in the cracked mirror, something shifted behind her eyes. Her mother had survived cancer, corporate warfare, and Victoria's poison long enough to set something in motion. The clock struck 8, 7 hours until 3 o'clock. At 9, Victoria summoned her to the breakfast room, not to eat, but to watch. Richard and Victoria feasted on eggs Benedict and champagne, while Margaret stood in the corner like a servant. Look at her, Richard, Victoria laughed, gesturing with her mimosa. This is what Catherine's daughter has become, a gray little mouse. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost? Richard asked, and for a moment, his eyes met Margaret's with something that might have been regret. Almost, Victoria confirmed, her smile sharpening. But not quite. Weakness deserves punishment. It's natural selection, darling. The strong devour the weak, and the Chen women were always too soft. She turned to Margaret directly. Your mother begged me, you know, in those final days. Begged me to leave you alone, to show mercy. Want to know what I said? Margaret's fingernails dug into her palms, but she remained silent. I told her I'd make sure you suffered every day for the rest of your miserable life. I told her I'd take everything, her husband, her home, her legacy, and I'd make you watch as I burned it all to ash. Victoria's eyes glittered with malice, and I told her there was nothing she could do to stop me because dead women have no power. At 2:30, they climbed into the limousine. Margaret sat in the back, facing Victoria and Richard, a position designed to maximize her humiliation. Marcus drove them through Manhattan traffic toward the office of Chen and Associates, the law firm Catherine had used for 30 years. Victoria was radiant with anticipated victory, her blood-red suit chosen to declare conquest. Richard stared out the window, his jaw clenched, and Margaret sat in her gray dress, clutching the photograph hidden in her pocket, watching the city her mother had conquered scroll past. At 2:55, the limousine pulled up to a gleaming skyscraper on Park Avenue. Through the tinted windows, Margaret saw him, the crippled beggar from the funeral, now cleaned up and leaning on a cane, waiting by the building's entrance. His eyes met hers, and he smiled like a wolf, welcoming prey into its den. Victoria saw him too and laughed. Look, even the street trash knows when to gather for scraps. But as they exited the limousine and approached the entrance, the beggar didn't retreat. He walked straight toward them, his limp pronounced, but his bearing suddenly regal. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been pretending to be powerless far too long. "Hello, Victoria Blackwood. It's time to pay for your sins." Victoria's laughter died in her throat, like a strangled bird. Her face, so perfectly composed in its cruelty, fractured for just a microsecond before the mask slammed back into place. "I don't know what you're talking about, you filthy—" "Your real name is Victoria Blackwood," the man said, his voice cutting through her denial like a surgical blade. He straightened slightly, his limp less pronounced now, and Margaret realized with growing shock that the twisted leg had been partially an act. Born in Queens, 1979, built Blackwood Enterprises through forged property deeds and fraudulent loans. Declared bankruptcy in 2019 after a federal investigation. Changed your name to Victoria Morrison, had extensive plastic surgery in Costa Rica, and spent 3 years hunting for your next mark. He smiled, and it was terrifying. You chose poorly. Richard's face had gone chalk white. Victoria? What is he talking about? He's insane, Victoria hissed, but her hand trembled as she clutched her Hermes bag. Richard, call the police. This vagrant is harassing us. Marcus moved forward, but the man raised his cane, a sleek black instrument with a silver handle, and Marcus froze. I wouldn't, Mr. Volkov. Or should I call you by your real name? Mikhail Volkov, wanted in 3 states for extortion and assault. Victoria recruited you from a Russian organized crime network 6 months ago specifically to intimidate the Chen family staff. Margaret's breath caught. Marcus, Mikhail, took a step back, his cold eyes suddenly showing fear. Who are you? Victoria's voice had risen to a shriek, her composure completely shattered. The man's smile widened. Where are my manners? Allow me to introduce myself properly. He extended his hand toward Margaret, ignoring Victoria completely. James Chen, your mother's first husband, your biological father's brother, and Catherine Chen's lawyer for the past 30 years. The world tilted sideways. Margaret stared at the hand, at the face she'd seen in that photograph, older now, weathered, but unmistakably the same man who'd stood beside her mother in front of that Manhattan skyscraper. Uncle James. The word felt foreign on her tongue. Her mother had never mentioned a James Chen. Catherine wanted to protect you from the uglier parts of her past, James said gently, his eyes, the same shape as Margaret's, filling with warmth. Your biological father was my younger brother, David. He died in a construction accident when you were 2 years old. Catherine was devastated. And Richard. He glanced at Richard with something between pity and contempt. Richard swept in to save her. But your mother never forgot David, and she never forgot that the Chen Empire was built on your father's blood and sacrifice. Richard stumbled backward, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. You told me your first husband abandoned you, you said. She lied to protect her daughter from you, James interrupted. Catherine knew what you were, a weak man susceptible to predators like Victoria. She kept you at arm's length from the real Chen fortune for 23 years, Richard. You thought you married into millions. You married into the carefully constructed facade. The real empire. He turned back to Margaret, his expression fierce with pride. Has always belonged to Catherine's bloodline, to David's daughter, to Margaret. Victoria lunged forward, her manicured nails aimed at James's face, but he sidestepped with surprising agility for a man with a cane. You're lying. I've seen every account, every property deed, every asset. Catherine died with nothing but medical debt. You saw what Catherine wanted you to see, James said calmly. He checked his watch. 2:58. Shall we go inside? The reading begins in 2 minutes, and trust me, Victoria, you won't want to miss this. He offered his arm to Margaret. She took it, feeling the solid strength beneath his sleeve, and together they walked toward the building's entrance. Behind them, Victoria was screaming at Richard, at Marcus, her carefully constructed world crumbling with every step Margaret took away from her. The lobby was marble and glass, soaring 30 feet high. James led them to a private elevator that required a key card. As the doors closed on Victoria's rage-twisted face, James turned to Margaret. Your mother loved you more than life itself. What she built, what she protected, what she hid, it was all for you. Today, you inherit not just money, but power that Victoria Blackwood couldn't even comprehend in her wildest dreams. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor into a conference room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. A long mahogany table stretched before them, and seated around it were faces Margaret had never seen. Men and women in expensive suits, their expressions unreadable. Ladies and gentlemen, James announced, Margaret Chen has arrived. Let the reading begin. Victoria burst through the stairwell door. She'd refused to wait for another elevator. Her face blotchy with rage and exertion, Richard trailing behind her like a whipped dog, Marcus bringing up the rear. This is insane. I demand. You demand nothing, James said, his voice suddenly cold as a tomb. Sit down, Victoria. Or leave. The choice is yours. But if you leave, you forfeit any chance of contesting what you are about to hear. Victoria sat, her body vibrating with barely contained fury. Richard collapsed into a chair beside her, his face in his hands. Margaret stood uncertainly until James guided her to the head of the table, her mother's seat. James opened a leather portfolio and began to read. I, Catherine Mei Lin Chen, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. His voice carried through the room like a bell tolling. To my husband, Richard Chen, I leave my wedding ring and the memory of what he once was before he betrayed everything we built together. Richard flinched as if struck. To Victoria Morrison, also known as Victoria Blackwood, I leave exactly $1 and a warning. You have stolen approximately $43 million from my estate through fraud, forgery, and extortion. Every transaction has been documented. Every forged signature has been analyzed. Every bribed official has been recorded. You have 72 hours to return every stolen penny before I authorize my executors to file criminal charges that will ensure you spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Victoria's face had gone from red to gray. You can't prove. James slid a 3-inch thick folder across the table. Bank records, wire transfers, recorded conversations, video surveillance, your own emails to your accomplices. Catherine spent her final 6 months building a case that would make federal prosecutors weep with joy. He smiled without humor. You're not just broke, Victoria. You're destroyed. He turned to the next page, and his voice softened. To my beloved daughter, Margaret Elizabeth Chen, I leave everything else. Everything else? Margaret whispered. But Victoria said there was nothing left. The medical bills. You murdered her, Margaret heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere deep and primal. She stood, her chair scraping against marble, her body moving on instinct toward Victoria. "You murdered my mother." "Prove it," Victoria spat, her mask finally cracking to reveal the monster beneath. "You can't prove anything. It was hospice medication. I was helping her die with dignity instead of suffering for months. I was being merciful." "You were being recorded," James said, and pressed a button on his laptop. Victoria's voice filled the room, a recording from what sounded like a phone call. "The old bitch is taking forever to die. I'm increasing the fentanyl again. Another 2 weeks and she'll be gone. Then everything will be ours." Victoria's face went from gray to green. That's inadmissible. You can't." "It's a recording Catherine made herself during your phone call to Marcus," James interrupted. "In New York, only one party needs to consent to recording." Catherine consented. "It's perfectly admissible, and it's currently in the hands of the Manhattan District Attorney, who's been waiting for this reading to conclude before filing murder charges." As if summoned by his words, the conference room doors opened, and 4 NYPD detectives entered, led by a woman with steel gray hair and merciless eyes. "Victoria Morrison, also known as Victoria Blackwood, you're under arrest for the murder of Catherine Chen, wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse." Victoria's scream was different this time, higher, desperate, the sound of someone watching their entire world collapse into ash. She fought as they handcuffed her, her designer suit tearing, her perfect hair coming loose, her mask of sophistication shredding to reveal the desperate criminal underneath. "Richard!" she shrieked as they dragged her toward the door. "Richard! Help me! You love me! You said you'd always protect me!" Richard sat frozen, staring at his hands, silent tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Volkov," the detective said, turning to Marcus, "we have some questions about your immigration status and your involvement in this conspiracy. Please come with us." Marcus, Mikhail, looked at Margaret with something that might have been respect, nodded once, and walked out with the detectives without resistance, a professional to the end. The door closed on Victoria's screams, and silence descended like a blanket of snow. James turned to Margaret. "There's one more thing." He pulled out a sealed letter with Catherine's handwriting on the envelope. "For Margaret, when justice is served." Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. Her mother's elegant script swam before her eyes. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, then Victoria has been arrested, and you know the truth about everything. I'm so sorry you had to endure her cruelty. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from Richard's weakness. But I needed you to see them for what they truly were before you inherited the power to destroy them. Power without wisdom is tyranny. Pain without purpose is merely suffering. You've survived both, my love, and now you understand what I've always known. The world is full of Victorias and Richards, people who will take everything from you if you let them. The $50 billion is yours, but it comes with a responsibility. Use it to build, not destroy. Use it to protect the innocent, not punish the guilty. The law will do that for you. Victoria will spend the rest of her life in prison. Richard will spend the rest of his life knowing what he lost. That is punishment enough. James will guide you through everything. The holdings, the corporations, the investments. Trust him as I trusted him. He was your father's brother, and he's been protecting our family's legacy since David died. I love you beyond measure. I'm sorry I had to leave you. But you were never alone, my darling. You never will be. Build your empire on love, not revenge. That's how you truly win. Forever yours, Mom Margaret's tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. Around the table, the suited figures, board members, executives, lawyers, watched her with expressions ranging from sympathy to calculation. They were waiting to see what kind of ruler she would become. James placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Your mother's helicopter is on the roof. You don't have to stay here. We can handle the paperwork, the transitions, everything. You can take time to grieve. Margaret looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows at Manhattan sprawling below her, her city now, in so many ways. Somewhere in that cityscape, Victoria was being processed into the system that would cage her forever. Richard sat behind her, a hollow man who'd traded gold for fool's gold and lost everything. No, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears. I want to see all of it. Every building, every property, every part of the empire Mom built. I want to understand what she died protecting. She turned to face the board members. And I want to know which of you stood by while Victoria tried to destroy my mother, and which of you tried to help. A woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and silver hair, pulled back in a severe bun, spoke first. I tried to warn Catherine about Richard's affair. She told me she knew and was handling it. I'm Eleanor Park, CFO of Chen Holdings. Your mother was my mentor for 30 years. One by one, they introduced themselves, executives who'd watched Catherine build an empire, who'd been helpless to stop Victoria's infiltration, but had documented everything for this moment. These were her mother's soldiers, and now they were Margaret's. Richard, Margaret said, finally turning to face the man who'd been her father. Leave. You have your wedding ring. You have your memories. You have nothing else. If I ever see you again, I'll have you arrested as an accessory to Victoria's crimes. James has evidence of your knowledge of her theft, your signatures on forged documents, your complicity in isolating my mother from her allies. You're not going to prison because my mother's last act of mercy was letting you walk away free. Richard stood on shaking legs, aged a decade in an hour. Margaret, you beat me at my mother's funeral, Margaret said, her voice like ice. You starved me, humiliated me, and watched Victoria try to destroy me. Whatever you were going to say, I don't want to hear it. Get out! He left, a broken man shuffling toward a life of nothing, and Margaret felt the weight of her mother's empire settle onto her shoulders like a crown made of sorrow and strength. Ms. Chen, James said gently, using her title for the first time. What would you like to do first? Margaret looked at her reflection in the glass, bruised, wearing a gray sack dress meant to humiliate her, eyes red from crying. She looked like a victim. But victims didn't inherit $50 billion. Victims didn't destroy their enemies so completely that those enemies would spend decades in cages. Victims didn't rebuild empires from ashes and blood. First, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived hell and emerged stronger. I want to donate $10 million to organizations that help abuse victims in my mother's name. Second, I want to establish a foundation to catch predators like Victoria before they can destroy other families. Third, she smiled, and it was her mother's smile, sharp and brilliant and unstoppable. I want to buy the prison where Victoria will be held and ensure her cell has a view of the Manhattan skyline she tried to steal. James's laugh was surprised and delighted. Your mother would be so proud. My mother was proud, Margaret corrected. She raised me to survive. Now I'll honor her by thriving. The city glittered below her. 50 billion opportunities waiting to be seized. And Margaret Chen, daughter of Catherine, heir to an empire built on sacrifice and protected by love, was finally ready to claim her throne.